from SYNTH-Werk, the creator of the Barberpole Phaser, and who Ampara is already mentioned, Luis Antunes Penas as well. So as I said, the idea of this panel is to talk about how to work on Bode, not so much as with Bode, but perhaps there's no real difference in between. And this goes the first question to you, Gerhard. When you recreated the Barberpole Phaser, how was it in difference to other instruments you already recreated by not using the archive? And that, I mean, this was the first time, the first project, where you had the usage and the capacity of the whole archive and all the documents, all the notebooks. You had you did not have that when you recreated the frequency shifter, as far as I know.
No. Well, it was pure luxury to have the archive because, you know, I was calling you and I need this and that, and you found it most of the times in the archive. So this was a very luxury situation. On the other hand, it would have been not possible because the Barberpole Phaser is the most complex instrument we recreated so far. So we basically started with the recreation of Robert Arthur Moog synthesizers, which is to some extent also complex, but not as complex as the Barberpole Phaser. I think what's absolutely necessary is you have to become like Harald Bode. You have to try to think like Harald Bode, and therefore it was extremely useful to have all the diaries from Harald Bode to see how he was thinking. And I mean, if you compare that to Robert Moog, for instance, it's a complete different approach. I mean, Robert Moog was designing tools for musicians, and Harald Bode was a musician designing instruments for musicians. It's a different approach. But there is a third person which impacts my life very much, which is Don Buchler from the West Coast in the US. Don Buchler had a complete different approach. I mean, he was also more a musician who was designing instruments for musicians, but without keyboards. He wanted to have no restrictions of a keyboard. So the characters of the persons designing an instrument are very important. That if you want to reconstruct them, you need to understand how their thinking is.
Juan, you also called your work a kind of reconstruction, right? And this is also going in a similar direction as Gerhard saying, Bode as a musician, as a composer, not only as an engineer and inventor. The archive played also a crucial role in your case, but...
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my first attempt to get into the world of Harald Bode for this project was a conversation I had with Gerhard. As in, well, what did you learn from him as a musician? Like, how... My question, I guess, I probably didn't formulate in the 2 hours of talking. Only afterwards I was like, this is what I wanted to ask. But how much getting into the decision-making that is embedded in its final form as an instrument can be deconstructed towards a musical aesthetic, no? I think that you said very much this distinction between Moog and Bode, as in Moog kind of more able to detach themselves and making, let's say, radical decisions like incorporating a keyboard for pragmatic reasons, and Bode is still very much thinking about, well, there is this musical, this sound aspiration in the air that he's trying to find circuits that will get closer to that. That suddenly becomes bigger than any musical aesthetic that he himself will be able to produce as a musician, or anyone else for that matter. So I think that there are two different things. And for me, the point was whether I could find that same germinal potential or aspirational idea in music by him. So I could try to trace the same, do the same exercise, but through his music rather than the tools.
I also think that this unfinished, or this process character of his composition and his also inventions are quite similar, right? There's no, you already said that when there was this question from the audience, there were very rarely finished products with Bode, the vocoder, for example, but this was because it was sold by, but even that, he never stopped to adjusting it, to change it. And all these conversations with musicians and buyers from his products, and the adjustments he did for those buyers. Like they sent in the machines to him, and he fixed problems, of course, but he also did adjustments for Usashevsky and others. And this is
if I may, just because it's something that we discovered at the archive, there were 2 documents with applications of Bode to a council in the US for funding to spend a year making music. And it was rejected 1 year. And then the application for the next year has the same piece as the argument to request the money, which is something that a professional composer will never do. Like, it's kind of career suicide. But there's a uniqueness in that approach, saying, no, I fixed this, this, and this. It's revision 2, which is very engineering. And it's like, and it doesn't matter, because what I'm asking money is to make music. And that's it sounds naive on one side, but at the same time, because of where that statement is coming from, you can tell that there's a depth in this thing. It's like, don't worry about what I did. I'm asking you to help me do the things that I haven't done yet. And I think that, that it doesn't work in the real world sometimes, and he has to build his own impossible world to make things happen.
I think that you mentioned the vocoder. I think not even the vocoder is a finished instrument yet. Because what you learn if you enter Harald Bode's world is there is always a reuse of specific parts of the instruments. For instance, Harald Bode is using a lot the so-called dome filter. Dome filter is a filter from an engineer out of the 20s, from Richard Dome, which was able to create a circuitry which gives you a 90-degree phase difference on 2 outputs. You have one input, a 90-degree phase output over a certain frequency range. And I told you today that I bought a Bode vocoder a couple of weeks ago, and I'm absolutely looking forward to put a dome filter on the output of this vocoder, because from my point of view, the vocoder is the most underestimated instrument on the planet. And it disappeared all of a sudden, and the musical world was moving on, but there are so many things you can do with a vocoder if you develop it a little bit further. And I think this is exactly the thinking of Harald Bode, develop the things further. And right now I also have improvements on the Barberpole Phaser in my mind, which needs to be done. And especially the combination of all the instruments, vocoder, Barberpole Phaser, and the frequency shifter, which forms the Klangumformer world of Harald Bode.
Well, I think that generally what you said about that some modules, some instruments are not explored to its limits. It's something that is quite for a thing of our time. So we know a lot about digital music and digital computing and programming language, but sometimes if you go one step behind and you look for how can you make music with just a simple thing like a ramp up and down, then you start to discover that well, actually you don't know so much about sound synthesis, yeah, because there is a lot to discover with very simple elements. And this kind of back to the, I would not say primitivity, but back to some roots of electronics is something that is very fascinating, I think, nowadays.
I mean, this is the irony of the Barberpole Phaser coming to life in 81, 82, 84, on the edge on the digital area of synthesizers, right? This is also the pity for him. I mean, the reason why only 3 were produced and 3 were sold, or 2 were sold, are because there was no market at that moment, and Bode, being a businessman, realized that also and stopped producing them for the market, because what he wished for, this change and this interest, was there from the audience, but nobody were really buying into it. They're interested in the concept, but they're not buying into the product. It was somehow still too expensive, and then he tried to change it to a simpler version, to a cheaper version. But this is what he's always did. He's always also thought about it for the vocoder, this kind of adapting to the market and to the market situation with this product.
Yes, I mean, this was the time when this was the typical transition phase from analog to digital. So you could get for 300 kilogram of a Moog synthesizer, you get one DX7. So nobody was using these big machines anymore. Everybody was saying, no, we don't need that anymore. We have digital now and everything is fine. Now we live in a very good time because we combine digital systems and analog systems. And this makes a lot of sense. And for Harald Bode, it was a real bad timing, because when the Barberpole Phaser came out, signal processing started, becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and you could do a lot of things digital. They sounded different, and there was also a time, I think about 10, 15, 20 years ago, I don't know exactly, when people started to become analog again and said, oh, maybe a Moog synthesizer is not too bad. So.
Well, we just observe also in the academy that that in the 90s, for example, these instruments were just substituted, and which is something substituted by computers, and this is something very interesting, because you forget also that beyond this discussion of what sounds better than the other, you just cannot replace one instrument by another. I mean, you cannot replace a violin by a digital violin. These are two different instruments with different possibilities, with a huge range of experimental possibilities. So you have to be aware of the differences. And this is something that I think today is very clear, and that many universities and schools, they start buying analog circuits, analog instruments, and combine with all technologies that we have now.
And I think that one thing that is also very relevant, I mean, I'm so envious of this part of the world. I mean, also, I'm from Chile originally, and I worship all these things from a distance. And now, the closer I get to the source, the more I'm like, man. I was here in October. I was having a conversation with you, talking about the ring modulator, and then I happened to meet in a forum a technician who still works at Lawo, who walked by and saw some boxes that were lying there, and he found some schematics of the Lawo ring modulator. So he stole them for me. But it's interesting because there's so much that was happening at the time, and to me, being slightly more of an outsider and looking with more admiration than art and culture are two different concepts in South America, especially with these aesthetics. Kunst and Kultur don't mix up as quickly as they do here. But in here, the fact that Lawo had some kind of agreement to develop technology that had to be attached to a commission with a relevant composer deep in his or hopefully her toes nowadays into the unknown, and that was politically supported. I think that those are the kind of things that without this kind of work that has to be holistic in terms of education, preservation of the tools, but also the preservation and dissemination of the repertoire, then these things will not exist in the future. I think that it's very important to promote this kind of initiatives and these ideas, but also with this kind of critical embracing of the sustainability of the past through the use of the tools. And I think that, as you were saying, this going back to analog things is also a very good way of learning limits, because the problem with digital emulations is that unless you are very disciplined, the limitlessness is achieved by the next computer that you're going to buy, you know. Yeah. So.
And this limitlessness is a little close to what you said about making it as complicated again, so that perhaps with those recreated analog systems, you are back in the 60s, 70s, where the studio itself defines also what you're composing, what you're doing, right? This is, I guess, the experience you had with your students and on your own during the research on the.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in former times, well, we had this experience in Essen where we had a SYNTH lab. Florian is here is the only one that worked with the SYNTH lab in the 90s, I think. And of course, it defines the sound and defines the possibilities. And when we were working with in the piece, so I was sometimes amazed by the sounds that they found out just by experimenting, but just feeding. In this case, the Barberpole Phaser with different inputs, with different spectra, and then, well, you're working really. I think this is really artistic work, artistic research. You just don't know what will happen, and then you decide upon the output. Yeah.
And did you already discover devices which are fitting good, or especially good to the Bode devices? Is there some similarities? I guess with Moog devices, or what is there any?
No, I wouldn't say that. There is the sound source. Of course, it depends what sound you get, depending on what sound you feed in. But it's not a good combination just with the Moog synthesizers or with Oberheim or with whatever. I mean, here experimenting makes a lot of sense.
I think all SYNTH-Werk products work very well with it.
Yes. Absolutely.
One thing we didn't mention yet, also not in my lecture, is that Bode actually started to work with the Commodore 64 in that age. So he was, and Per told me also, he was very interested into using the computer and adjusting it, but it was just too late in his life to really input have a significant input in his recreation. But is it something you also imagine to include this switch to some digital parts of the Barberpole Phaser or other devices? Or
yeah, we got approached by a company who is digitalizing analog things, and they are interested in digitalizing the Barberpole Phaser as to sell it as a plugin, but I'm not really sure if I want to do that, because the Barberpole Phaser is as it is, and I want to develop the Barberpole Phaser and all the Bode instruments further. And I'm not sure if a statement where we say this is the digital version of it is the right statement.
But continue this process of invention and creation, could you imagine also to follow a similar path than Bode, or are you doing that already perhaps, to include artists into this thinking process, like include this dialogue of those who are using the machines to adjusting the machines?
Oh yeah, we do this a lot. I mean, we are in very close contact with all kind of artists. One of our lovely artists is Hans Zimmer, which is using our big machines on stage, and he is full of ideas, or also Kraftwerk or smaller artists. So we are very close to artists on that.
Will that also help the musicians to be able to have an impact on the machines themselves, or is it something? Is it more? It's already complicated enough when you are.
I don't think that complicated is the right word. I mean, I think that, of course, in terms of immediate satisfaction, the learning curve is a little bit more, but I think that is in itself an encouragement, and I think, and I do agree that keeping things analog do force you to treat them as an instrument that has a learning curve. And I mean, it took me like a couple of hours to understand the difference between the two suggested feedback patches, for example. Yes. Not in terms of functionality, but in terms of what is really changing here. And a lot of it had to do with how much you drive the input. So there are more harmonics, and there's a distortion signal, and that is feeding the feedback loop, so you can then frequency shift that incoming distorted signal. So there's a lot to be learned and explored. in the limitations. So if anything, I think that what these tools can provide musicians are a set of limitations that you can overcome. And that is more analog to a traditional instrument, in a way. I think that in that, of course, to have the possibility to have a conversation with the designers or with people who are more technically involved in the development of these things is useful, but it's useful in as much as it encourages you to demystify. It's the math lesson that Per got. No? It's that. I mean, yes, you don't have to get it all, but it will be a mistake to think that it's not for you before you try it. You know, I think that is the point.
I want to open up the panel for questions from the audience. But I have to leave the light. I don't see any. But also, if you want to discuss something in between you. Oh, there's one question. Nice.
Sorry, it's not really a question for the panel, but maybe you know. I'm curious, the Barberpole #1 out there has a Made in China sticker on it. I'm curious about that.
For me, excuse me, I didn't understand.
There's a sticker on, so inside the vitrine is the Barberpole Phaser #1.
Yeah.
And on top is a Made in China sticker.
Yeah, this was from Bea probably, not from me. I can guarantee you that this Barberpole Phaser is not made in China.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's why maybe. Yeah.
I think this was one of Harald's jokes. So
that's what I kind of thought. It's somebody stuck it on.
Maybe it could be a good sign that you're really producing a lot.
Okay. Then we can head to the coffee break and continue after in 20 minutes or 30 minutes. I have to check. Thank you.